a judge fined a royal guard for disrupting the court in what he assumed was just a ceremonial costume, thinking the guard was nothing more than a symbolic presence. But then the guard spoke, and within moments, the judge realized he wasn't dealing with a mere performer, but a Cambridge-educated legal expert. What happened next left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow, at this same time, we're releasing another powerful royal guard story you won't want to miss. The morning fog clung to the cobblestones of Fleet Street like a shroud, and somewhere in the distance, the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral chimed 7 times. It was Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, and Lieutenant Malcolm Reynolds was about to walk into what would become one of the most dramatic courtroom confrontations in British legal history. The Old Bailey stood before him like a fortress of justice, its imposing Victorian facade weathered by centuries of London's relentless reign. Reynolds paused at the entrance, his scarlet tunic pristine despite the morning's drizzle, the brass buttons catching what little sunlight managed to pierce through the grey clouds. His bearskin hat, a symbol of honor that had been earned through blood and sacrifice, sat perfectly positioned on his head. The ceremonial sword at his side wasn't just ornamental, it represented a tradition stretching back to the Guards' formation in 1656. What the gathering crowd of barristers, journalists, and court staff didn't know was that Reynolds wasn't just any royal guard. Behind the ceremonial uniform was a man who had graduated summa cum laude from Cambridge Law School, who had served as a senior associate at one of London's most prestigious law firms, and who had chosen to leave a 7-figure salary to serve Queen and country in a different capacity. The security guards at the entrance nodded respectfully as Reynolds passed through the metal detectors. His uniform triggered no alarms. Every piece was authentic, every medal earned through service in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Victoria Cross ribbon on his chest wasn't for show. It was awarded after Reynolds had single-handedly held off a Taliban assault for 6 hours while wounded, saving the lives of 12 civilians and 4 fellow soldiers. As Reynolds climbed the marble steps toward courtroom number 3, he reflected on what had brought him here. 3 months earlier, he had been approached by Margaret Henley, a 73-year-old widow who was facing eviction from her council flat of 40 years. Her landlord, a property development company called Meridian Holdings, was claiming she had violated her lease by keeping a cat. The fine was £50,000, an impossible sum for someone living on a pension of £180 per week. What had caught Reynolds' attention wasn't just the cruelty of the case, but the judge assigned to it, Harold Blackwood, a man whose recent rulings had shown a disturbing pattern of favoring wealthy developers over vulnerable tenants. Reynolds had started investigating, using his legal training and military discipline to uncover what he suspected was a web of corruption that reached deep into the heart of the British judicial system. The courtroom doors opened with a creak that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Courtroom number 3 was a testament to British legal tradition, oak paneling darkened by centuries of smoke and argument, stained glass windows depicting scales of justice, and portraits of long-dead judges gazing down with stern disapproval. The public gallery was packed with curious onlookers, legal students, and a handful of journalists who had caught wind that something interesting might happen. Reynolds took his seat in the back row of the gallery, his military bearing impossible to ignore. Conversations died as people noticed the imposing figure in full ceremonial dress. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if this was some sort of publicity stunt or if the guard had gotten lost on his way to a changing of the guard ceremony. Judge Harold Blackwood entered through the judicial door, his black robes flowing behind him like the wings of a vulture. At 62, Blackwood was a man whose face had been carved by years of self-indulgence and cruelty. His jowls hung heavy, his eyes were small and calculating, and his mouth was set in a permanent sneer of disdain. He had been appointed to the bench 15 years earlier, and in that time, he had developed a reputation for harsh sentences and little patience for defendants who couldn't afford proper representation. All rise for his honor, Judge Blackwood called the bailiff, and the courtroom rustled to attention. Blackwood settled into his elevated chair like a king claiming his throne, his eyes scanning the crowd with the lazy arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. The case before him was another eviction hearing, the 5th that morning. These were the cases that made Blackwood's day. Quick rubber stamp affairs that cleared his docket and filled his pockets. What the defendants didn't know was that Blackwood had been receiving £5,000 for every eviction he approved, money that was funneled through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. As the morning progressed, Reynolds watched with growing disgust as Blackwood dismissed case after case with callous efficiency. An elderly man who had lived in his flat for 30 years was evicted because he couldn't afford to repair a broken window. A single mother with 3 children was thrown out because she had painted her daughter's bedroom without permission. A disabled veteran was removed from his adapted home because he had installed grab bars in the bathroom without written consent. Each ruling was a travesty of justice. Each decision a betrayal of the oath Blackwood had taken to serve the law impartially. Reynolds' jaw tightened as he watched, his military training keeping his emotions in check, while his legal mind catalogued each violation of procedure, each abuse of power. The courtroom was hot and stuffy, the air thick with the smell of old wood and nervous sweat. The legal clerks shuffled papers mechanically, their faces blank with the indifference that comes from witnessing injustice so regularly that it becomes routine. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting each word of what would later be revealed as one of the most corrupt judicial performances in modern British history. It was during a brief recess that Blackwood first noticed Reynolds. The judge was returning from his chambers, where he had been reviewing the afternoon's cases and calculating how much money each eviction would bring him. His eyes swept the gallery dismissively until they landed on the figure in scarlet and gold. Blackwood's face immediately darkened. In his worldview, there was no room for military pageantry in his courtroom. He saw the uniform not as a symbol of service and sacrifice, but as a challenge to his authority. The fact that Reynolds sat perfectly still, his bearing ramrod straight and his expression neutral, only added to Blackwood's irritation. "Mr. Whatever you are," Blackwood's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a rusty blade. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes turning to the confrontation that was about to unfold. "This isn't a pantomime. Remove that ridiculous hat or I'll hold you in contempt." The gallery erupted in nervous laughter, but Reynolds remained motionless. His face showed no emotion, no reaction to the insult. He had faced down Taliban fighters and corrupt Afghan officials. A petty tyrant in a wig didn't intimidate him. Blackwood's face reddened at the lack of response. In his 15 years on the bench, no one had dared to ignore his commands. His authority was absolute within these walls, or so he believed. The fact that this soldier, this dressed-up toy soldier, as he saw it, refused to acknowledge his power was an affront that demanded immediate punishment. £2,000 fine for disrupting my courtroom. Blackwood slammed his gavel with the force of a man desperate to reassert his dominance. Section 14B of the Judicial Conduct Act clearly states that inappropriate attire is grounds for contempt charges. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several barristers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, their legal training telling them that something was wrong with Blackwood's citation. The court reporter's fingers hesitated over her keyboard, her professional instincts warning her that she was about to record something that would later prove embarrassing. It was then that Reynolds spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had commanded troops in combat and argued cases before the Supreme Court. "With respect, Your Honor, there is no Section 1 for B." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that falls when everyone in a room suddenly realizes that they are witnessing something historic, something that will be talked about for years to come. The court reporter's hands froze above her keyboard. The bailiff's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Blackwood's face went through a spectrum of colors, from red to purple to a sickly gray, as the implications of what had just happened began to sink in. He had just been publicly corrected by a member of the gallery, and not just on any minor point, but on a fundamental matter of law. Worse, he had a growing suspicion that the correction was accurate. Reynolds rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate and controlled. At 6 feet 2 inches, he was an imposing figure, even without the uniform. But dressed in the full ceremonial regalia of the Queen's Guard, he commanded the attention of every person in the room. His medals caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, each one a testament to courage under fire. "What does exist," Reynolds continued, his voice carrying clearly through the vaulted chamber, "is the Crown Courts Act 1971, Article 9, which guarantees public access to court proceedings, regardless of attire. provided it does not disrupt the proceedings. There is also the Armed Forces Act 2006, Section 369, which specifically protects the right of service members to wear uniform while off duty, including in civilian buildings. The legal knowledge flowed from Reynolds like water from a broken dam. For 15 years, he had been preparing for this moment, studying every aspect of judicial procedure, every protection afforded to military personnel, every precedent that might be relevant to the corruption he had uncovered. Furthermore, Reynolds continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. The Contempt of Court Act 1981 requires that any finding of contempt must be based on behavior that actually interferes with the administration of justice. Sitting quietly in appropriate dress hardly meets that standard. Blackwood's hands shook as he gripped the bench. He was beginning to realize that he was not dealing with some ceremonial soldier who had wandered into the wrong building. This was a man who knew the law, possibly better than Blackwood himself. The judge's mind raced, trying to find some way to salvage his authority, some legal precedent that would allow him to maintain control of the situation. "Are you a lawyer?" Blackwood asked, his voice smaller now, less confident. "I am a member of the Inner Temple," Reynolds replied. "Called to the bar in 2008. I practiced commercial law at Clifford Chance for 7 years before accepting my commission in the Grenadier Guards." The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Clifford Chance was one of the most prestigious law firms in the world, the kind of place where only the brightest legal minds were invited to practice. The fact that Reynolds had given up a partnership track at such a firm to serve his country spoke to a character that was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone in the room. "You left Clifford Chance to become a soldier?" Blackwood asked, his voice betraying a mixture of disbelief and growing respect. "I left corporate law to serve something greater than profit margins," Reynolds replied. "I found that defending one's country provides a different kind of satisfaction than defending corporate tax avoidance schemes." The barristers in the gallery began to whisper among themselves. Several of them recognized Reynolds' name now. He had been legendary at Clifford Chance, known for his brilliant legal mind and his absolute integrity. His departure from the firm had been the subject of much speculation in legal circles, with many assuming he had been lured away by a competing firm offering an even larger salary. As the murmur of conversation grew louder, Blackwood felt his authority slipping away like sand through his fingers. He had built his career on intimidation and the assumption that most people who appeared before him were too poor, too uneducated, or too frightened to challenge his rulings. Reynolds represented everything Blackwood was not: integrity, genuine authority, and the kind of moral courage that comes from facing real danger in service of others. The judge's mind raced back to his conversation with Marcus Pemberton, the CEO of Meridian Holdings, just 3 days earlier. Pemberton had assured him that the afternoon's eviction cases would be routine, that the tenants were all undesirable elements who wouldn't put up any resistance. The £25,000 payment for approving 5 evictions had already been deposited into Blackwood's Cayman Islands account. What Pemberton hadn't mentioned was that one of the tenants had connections to someone like Reynolds. The judge was beginning to suspect that this confrontation was not accidental, that somehow his corruption had attracted the attention of someone with both the legal knowledge and the moral authority to challenge him. The bailiff, sensing the tension in the room, moved closer to the bench. Thomas Mitchell had been working as a court bailiff for 20 years, and he had never seen a judge look as rattled as Blackwood did at that moment. Mitchell's own military background, he had served in the Royal Navy before joining the court. Service made him naturally sympathetic to Reynolds, and he was beginning to enjoy watching the pompous judge squirm. "Your Honor," Mitchell said quietly, leaning close to Blackwood's ear, "perhaps we should take a short recess." Blackwood nodded gratefully, his face pale with sweat despite the cool October air. "The court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced, his voice barely above a whisper, as the judge hurried toward his chambers. Reynolds remained standing, his posture as perfect as if he were on parade at Buckingham Palace. The gallery buzzed with excited conversation, with many of the observers pulling out their phones to Google Reynolds' background and confirm the incredible story they had just heard. Sarah Chen, a legal correspondent for The Guardian, was already drafting her story in her head. She had come to the Old Bailey expecting to cover a routine eviction case, but instead had stumbled onto what promised to be the legal story of the year. Her fingers flew across her phone screen as she sent a message to her editor. "Cancel my Afternoon schedule. I've got a story that's going to be front page tomorrow. During the recess, Reynolds received a visitor, Margaret Henley, the 73-year-old widow whose case had brought him to the courtroom, approached him with tears in her eyes. She was a small, frail woman who looked every day of her 73 years, but her eyes held a strength that reminded Reynolds of his own grandmother. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. I've been so frightened about losing my home. I've lived there for 40 years, raised my children there, nursed my husband through his final illness there. That flat is all I have left of my life." Reynolds took her hands in his, feeling the papery skin and the slight tremor that spoke of a life lived through hardship and loss. "Mrs. Henley, you don't need to thank me. What's being done to you is wrong, and sometimes good people need to stand up when they see wrong being done." "But why?" she asked. "Why would you risk your career, your reputation, for an old woman you barely know?" Reynolds was quiet for a moment, his mind drifting back to Afghanistan, to a village outside Kandahar where he had seen what happened when good people did nothing in the face of injustice. "Because I swore an oath, Mrs. Henley, not just to the Queen, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves. That oath doesn't end when I take off the uniform." When court reconvened, Blackwood looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 15 minutes. His face was grey, his hands shook as he shuffled through his papers, and his usual arrogant demeanor had been replaced by something approaching panic. He had spent the recess frantically searching through his legal references, trying to find some precedent that would support his actions, but had found nothing. Worse, he had received a text message from Pemberton that made his blood run cold. "Problem: someone's been asking questions about our arrangement. Suggest you proceed with extreme caution." The judge's chambers had felt like a prison cell during the recess. He had paced back and forth, his mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. If Reynolds was investigating his corruption, if he had evidence of the bribes and kickbacks, then everything Blackwood had built over the past 15 years was in jeopardy. As the afternoon session began, Reynolds noticed something that others might have missed. A man in a dark suit had entered the courtroom and taken a seat near the back. His bearing and the way his eyes constantly scanned the room marked him as law enforcement, probably SID or Serious Fraud Office. Reynolds had seen enough undercover officers during his military service to recognize the type. The first case of the afternoon was Margaret Henley's eviction hearing. As her name was called, the elderly woman made her way slowly to the defendant's table, her arthritis making each step painful. She was accompanied by a young legal aid solicitor who looked barely old enough to have passed his bar exam. "Your Honor," the solicitor began, his voice shaking with nervousness, "my client has been a model tenant for 40 years. The alleged lease violation, keeping a cat, is hardly grounds for eviction, especially given that the cat in question is a therapy animal prescribed by her doctor for anxiety and depression." Blackwood barely glanced at the papers in front of him. His usual procedure was to rubber stamp the eviction and move on to the next case. But Reynolds' presence had changed everything. He was aware that every word he spoke was being scrutinized, every decision analyzed for signs of corruption. "The lease clearly states, no pets," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "With respect, Your Honor," the solicitor replied, gathering courage from Reynolds' earlier performance. "The Equality Act, 2010, requires reasonable accommodations for disabled tenants. My client's anxiety disorder qualifies as a disability under the Act, and her doctor's prescription for a therapy animal constitutes medical necessity." Reynolds watched with satisfaction as the young solicitor cited the relevant sections of the Equality Act. It was clear that the lawyer had been inspired by the earlier legal display and was now prepared to fight for his client rather than simply accept defeat. Blackwood found himself trapped between his usual corruption and the growing realization that his every move was being watched and evaluated. The mysterious man in the dark suit was taking notes, and Reynolds was recording the proceedings on his phone, perfectly legal under the open justice principle he had cited earlier. "The defendant's medical needs," Blackwood said reluctantly, "appear to create a legitimate exception to the pet policy." Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Margaret Henley burst into tears of relief, while her solicitor looked stunned at the unexpected victory. Reynolds allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction, but his expression quickly returned to its neutral mask. What happened next would be talked about in legal circles for years to come. As Blackwood prepared to call the next case, The man in the dark suit stood up and walked toward the bench. He was joined by a second man who had been sitting in the gallery, and Reynolds recognized the choreographed movement of law enforcement officers making an arrest. "Harold Blackwood," the first man said, producing a warrant card that identified him as Detective Inspector James Morrison of the Serious Fraud Office. "You are under arrest on suspicion of bribery, corruption, and perverting the course of justice." The courtroom exploded into chaos as the reality of what was happening sank in. Blackwood's face went from gray to white as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The judge who had terrorized tenants and defendants for 15 years was being led away like a common criminal, his judicial robes looking more like a costume than a symbol of authority. "You have the right to remain silent," D. Morrison continued, his voice carrying clearly through the pandemonium. "But it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." Reynolds remained seated throughout the arrest, his expression unchanged. He had known this moment was coming for 3 months, ever since he had begun his investigation into Blackwood's corruption. The evidence he had gathered, financial records, recorded conversations, testimony from victims had been carefully compiled and handed over to the authorities 6 weeks earlier. The investigation had been triggered by Margaret Henley's desperate phone call to Reynolds. She had heard about his legal background through a friend at the British Legion and had begged him to look into her case. What Reynolds had discovered was a web of corruption that stretched far beyond one elderly woman's eviction. Over the course of 2 months, Reynolds had documented 17 cases where Blackwood had ruled in favor of property developers in exchange for substantial payments. The judge's lifestyle had improved dramatically over the past 5 years. Expensive holidays, a new Jaguar, a boat moored in Monaco, all funded by the systematic destruction of working-class communities. The evidence had been methodically gathered using Reynolds' military training and legal expertise. He had posed as a potential property investor, recording conversations with Pemberton and other developers about their special relationship with certain judges. He had analyzed patterns in court rulings, identifying suspicious clusters of decisions that favored the same companies. Most damaging of all, Reynolds had discovered that Blackwood's corruption extended beyond simple bribery. The judge had been deliberately targeting vulnerable tenants, the elderly, the disabled, single mothers, immigrants, people who were least likely to have the resources to fight back. It was a systematic campaign of judicial terrorism designed to clear profitable properties for redevelopment. That's Blackwood was led away in handcuffs. Reynolds thought about the military concept of mission accomplished. He had identified a threat to the innocent, gathered intelligence, and neutralized that threat using the appropriate legal channels. The fact that he had been able to do so while maintaining his integrity and following proper procedures was a source of deep satisfaction. The courtroom began to empty as word of the arrest spread throughout the Old Bailey. Journalists rushed to file their stories. Legal clerks whispered excitedly about what they had witnessed, and the remaining defendants in the afternoon's docket wondered whether their cases would now be heard by a different judge. Margaret Henley approached Reynolds as he prepared to leave, her face glowing with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You saved my home," she said simply. "But more than that, you saved my faith in justice." "Justice saved itself, Mrs. Henley," Reynolds replied. "I just helped clear away some of the obstacles that were blocking its path." As they walked together toward the exit, Reynolds reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. His decision to leave corporate law had been driven by a growing sense that his skills and education were being wasted on helping wealthy clients avoid taxes and circumvent regulations. The military had given him a sense of purpose, a chance to serve something greater than profit margins. But it was moments like this that reminded him why he had studied law in the first place. The law, when properly applied, was one of humanity's greatest achievements, a system that could protect the weak from the strong, that could hold the powerful accountable for their actions, that could ensure that justice was more than just an abstract concept. The story of what happened at the Old Bailey that day spread like wildfire through social media and traditional news outlets. Within hours, video footage of Blackwood's arrest was trending on Twitter, and Reynolds found himself being hailed as a hero by people who had never heard of him before that morning. But Reynolds was uncomfortable with the attention. He had not acted out of a desire for fame or recognition, but out of a simple belief that corruption needed to be confronted, regardless of where it was found. The real heroes, he believed, were people like Margaret Henley, who had the courage to ask for help when they saw injustice, and the young legal aid solicitor who had found his voice in the face of intimidation. The investigation that followed Blackwood's arrest revealed the full scope of the corruption. Over the course of the next 6 months, 17 property developers, 4 court officials, and 2 other judges were arrested and charged with various offenses related to the bribery scheme. The total amount of money involved was estimated at over £2 million, with hundreds of families having been illegally evicted from their homes. Reynolds was called to testify before a parliamentary committee investigating judicial corruption. His testimony, delivered in the same calm, measured tone he had used in Blackwood's courtroom, painted a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even experienced politicians. "The problem," Reynolds told the committee, "is not that we have corrupt judges. The problem is that we have created a system where corruption can flourish unchecked. When judges are overworked, underpaid, and subject to little meaningful oversight, we should not be surprised when some of them succumb to temptation." His recommendations for reform were comprehensive and practical. Increased judicial salaries to reduce the temptation of bribery, regular financial audits of judges' personal finances, mandatory rotation of judges to prevent the development of cozy relationships with local lawyers and developers, and most importantly, the creation of an independent body to investigate complaints against judges, staffed by people with both legal expertise and investigative experience. The committee's report, published 8 months after Blackwood's arrest, adopted most of Reynolds' recommendations. The Judicial Integrity Act of 2025 became law the following year, creating new safeguards against corruption and establishing clear procedures for investigating judicial misconduct. But for Reynolds, the most satisfying outcome was much simpler. Margaret Henley remained in her council flat, her cat purring contentedly on her lap as she watched the news coverage of the corruption scandal. 17 other families who had been illegally evicted were allowed to return to their homes, with compensation paid by the developers who had profited from the scheme. The young legal aid solicitor who had represented Margaret Henley went on to specialize in housing law, inspired by Reynolds' example, to fight for tenants' rights. He later established a charity that provided free legal advice to vulnerable tenants, funded in part by donations from people who had been moved by the story of the Old Bailey confrontation. Reynolds himself returned to his military duties, but he remained involved in legal reform efforts. He became a patron of several legal charities and regularly spoke at law schools about the importance of integrity in the legal profession. His message was always the same: the law is only as strong as the people who enforce it, and everyone has a responsibility to speak up when they see justice being perverted. 2 years after the Old Bailey confrontation, Reynolds received an unexpected visitor at his barracks. Margaret Henley, now 75, and moving more slowly, but still sharp as a tack, had come to invite him to her granddaughter's wedding. The young woman was marrying a barrister she had met at university, and Margaret wanted Reynolds to know that his example had inspired a new generation of lawyers to enter the profession. "She says she wants to be like you," Margaret told Reynolds as they sat in the modest visitors' room at Wellington Barracks. "She wants to use the law to help people who can't help themselves." Reynolds was touched by the gesture, but he was also aware that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond one elderly woman's flat. The corruption scandal had damaged public trust in the judicial system, and it had taken years of careful reform to begin restoring that trust. The media attention had been difficult for Reynolds to handle. He had never sought the spotlight, and he found the constant requests for interviews and appearances to be a distraction from his military duties. More troubling was the way some commentators had tried to turn him into a political symbol, claiming that his actions supported various political agendas. "I'm not a political figure," Reynolds had said in one of his rare interviews. "I'm a soldier who happened to have legal training. I saw an injustice and I used the tools available to me to address it. That's not politics, that's basic human decency." The investigation into judicial corruption had revealed uncomfortable truths about the British legal system. It had shown that corruption was not limited to a few bad actors, but was enabled by systemic weaknesses that made it difficult to detect and prosecute. The reforms that followed were necessary but insufficient, and Reynolds knew that the fight for judicial integrity would be ongoing. But there had been positive developments as well. The Law Society had established new ethics training requirements for all practicing solicitors and barristers. Law schools had incorporated courses on judicial integrity into their curricula, and most importantly, public awareness of judicial corruption had increased dramatically, making it more difficult for corrupt judges to operate with impunity. Reynolds had also been forced to confront his own motivations for exposing Blackwood's corruption. While he genuinely believed that his actions were motivated by a desire for justice, he had to acknowledge that part of his satisfaction came from using his legal knowledge to defeat a bully who had terrorized vulnerable people for years. The military psychologist who conducted Reynolds' annual fitness evaluation had probed this issue extensively. "You've described yourself as a protector," the psychologist had noted, "but there's a fine line between protection and vigilantism. How do you know when you've crossed that line?" Reynolds had thought carefully about the question. "I follow the law," he had finally answered. "I gather evidence, I present it to the appropriate authorities, and I let the system work. I don't take matters into my own hands. I don't seek revenge, I seek justice, and I use legal means to achieve it." The distinction was important to Reynolds because he recognized that his unique combination of legal training and military experience gave him capabilities that could be misused. He had seen what happened in countries where the rule of law broke down, where people took justice into their own hands, where might made right. The British legal system, for all its flaws, was preferable to the alternatives. 5 years after the Old Bailey confrontation, Reynolds was promoted to major and given command of a company of Grenadier Guards. The promotion ceremony was held at St. James's Palace, with members of the royal family in attendance. As he stood at attention while the new insignia were pinned to his uniform, Reynolds reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The corruption scandal had become a case study in law schools around the world, used to illustrate the importance of judicial integrity and the role that individual courage can play in upholding the rule of law. Reynolds had received honorary degrees from several universities, awards from legal organizations, and recognition from human rights groups. But the recognition that meant the most to him came from unexpected sources. A group of Afghan interpreters who had worked with British forces had sent him a letter thanking him for showing that British justice could be trusted. A class of primary school children in Manchester had written to thank him for helping their teacher's grandmother keep her flat. A group of military veterans had established a scholarship in his name for young people who wanted to study law. But Margaret Henley had become something of a celebrity in her own right, regularly invited to speak at events about tenants' rights and judicial reform. She had used her newfound platform to advocate for other vulnerable people, and her flat had become an informal headquarters for local housing activists. "People ask me if I'm angry about what happened," she told a television interviewer on the 5th anniversary of the Old Bailey confrontation. "But I'm not angry. I'm grateful. Grateful that there are people like Major Reynolds who believe that justice matters more than money, who will stand up for what's right even when it's difficult." The interviewer had asked Margaret what she thought was the most important lesson from the whole affair. Her answer had been characteristically direct. "The most important lesson is that ordinary people have more power than they realize. I was just an old woman with a cat. But I had something that corrupt judges and greedy developers couldn't buy. I had the truth. And the truth, when it's backed up by courage and determination, is more powerful than all the money in the world." Reynolds had watched the interview from his quarters at Wellington Barracks, his current posting as a training instructor for new Guards officers. He had found Margaret's words both inspiring and humbling. She had shown remarkable courage in reaching out to him, and her faith in the system had been vindicated by the outcome. But Reynolds also knew that not every case of corruption would be exposed so dramatically. Most injustices were subtle, incremental, erosions of fairness that accumulated over time until they became systemic problems. The fight for justice required constant vigilance, not just dramatic confrontations. The military had taught Reynolds that the most important battles were often the ones that no one saw. The daily choices to do the right thing even when it was difficult or inconvenient. The Old Bailey confrontation had been a public moment, but it had been built on thousands of private moments. The decision to leave a lucrative law firm, the choice to investigate Margaret Henley's case, the discipline to gather evidence methodically rather than rushing to judgment. As Reynolds approached his 50th birthday, he began to think about what he would do after his military service ended. The corruption scandal had opened doors that he had never expected, offers to join law firms, invitations to teach at universities, opportunities to work with international organizations fighting corruption around the world. But Reynolds found himself drawn to a different path. He had been approached by a group of retired judges and senior barristers who were establishing a new organization focused on judicial integrity. The organization would provide training for judges, investigate complaints about judicial misconduct, and advocate for reforms to prevent corruption. "We need someone who understands both the law and the practical challenges of fighting corruption," Lord Justice Patricia Thornton had told Reynolds when she approached him about joining the organization. "Someone who has credibility with both the legal profession and the public. Someone who has proven that they will put principle above personal advantage." Reynolds had been intrigued by the offer, but he had also been cautious. He had seen how easily good intentions could be corrupted by politics and self-interest. He had insisted on a clear mandate, adequate funding, and independence from both government and the legal establishment. The organization, tentatively called the Judicial Integrity Institute, would be funded by a combination of government grants, private donations, and fees from training programs. It would have the power to investigate complaints, recommend disciplinary action, and publish reports on judicial conduct. Most importantly, it would have the authority to conduct random audits of judges' financial affairs, a power that Reynolds considered essential for preventing corruption. The institute would also serve as a resource for lawyers and citizens who suspected judicial misconduct. It would provide legal advice, investigate complaints, and where appropriate, refer cases to law enforcement agencies. The goal was to create a system where corruption could be detected and addressed before it became entrenched. Reynolds had accepted the position as the institute's first director, with the understanding that he would take up the role after retiring from the military. He had spent months developing the organization's structure, hiring staff, and building relationships with stakeholders across the legal system. The work was challenging but rewarding. Reynolds found that his military experience was invaluable in creating efficient procedures and maintaining focus on the organization's mission. His legal background allowed him to understand the complex issues involved in judicial oversight, and his reputation from the Old Bailey confrontation gave him credibility with both the media and the public. The Institute's first major case involved a family court